Hello, my name is Stephen Thomas, and this is another video in the series about Azure Integration Services and hybrid options. This video is an introduction to Azure Logic Apps. For somebody who hasn't worked with Azure Logic Apps in the past, or who knows very little about them, this is a great place to start. We're going to cover some of the very basics, and then take a look at a demo showing the very basic, simple things you need to understand about a consumption-based Logic App. So let's get started with a little bit of history around Logic Apps. So believe it or not, Logic Apps have been around for over 7 years now. They've existed in a couple different forms, but the current rendition of what we call Logic Apps is 7 years old now. Originally, it started, I'd consider it a V0, and it was called Azure BizTalk Services. This was Microsoft's first attempt at taking some on-premise BizTalk resources and kind of moving them into the cloud. So they started with EDI components. So there was EDI, AS2 messaging, transformation schemas, the EDI schemas, stuff like that. That kind of morphed into integration accounts, which I covered in another video, but BizTalk Services isn't there anymore in Azure. Then we started to see this V1 of Logic Apps. I'm not sure V1 was actually ever released. It came later after Azure BizTalk Services. It had a lot of interesting features to it, so connectors such as like the SQL connector and stuff like that. You had to self-host these connectors. So you had to deploy an instance of the connector kind of to your Logic app container and then kind of use these deployed resources. You couldn't just grab a connector and go like you can today. This then turned into what we call V2. This is what we think of as consumption-based Logic Apps today. It was very simple. It was the serverless model, so it was pay per use. This was really thought of as this. So this was what came out kind of 7 years ago. Was this release of the Logic Apps? So this was kind of thought of as pay-per-use model that clients would really like. It was nice because if you created Logic Apps and then they were only called once or twice a day, you only paid a fraction of pennies for each of those executions in general for their Logic Apps. Your connectors were now Microsoft hosted, Microsoft managed connectors, so you didn't have to deploy them out anymore. And it made it really nice and able to use a bunch of different connectors. And then Microsoft was responsible for updating and maintaining those connectors. So that was good. A few years, 3 or 4 years after kind of consumption Logic Apps came out, there came a new kind of release of Logic Apps called Standard Model, Standard Logic Apps. This was Microsoft's kind of answer to the unpredictability of serverless. So people love serverless. It was great. And then it was a little bit harder to explain to the business that your bill is going to be variable each month. And I can't really predict to the penny that they would like how much that bill is going to be. So standard edition model came out, supports a more fixed fee pricing model. So you buy like a unit of compute essentially at a monthly level. And we get a lot more into this in another video. But standard can also run locally, which was a big ask. So consumption-based is serverless, run in Microsoft's Azure, and the standard edition can choose to run in Microsoft Azure, or you can self-host and run it yourself. So that was a big plus to standard edition as well. Now there's a few different options between standard and consumption. They kind of each have their own place. It can kind of get a little confusing sometimes. So, really it's a lot of options. Is it always better? Hard to say. But we'll see. We have a whole video on standard versus consumption Logic Apps. So we can dive into it and take a much deeper look at those two. So talk about BizTalk Reuse. A lot of people coming to Logic Apps have existing BizTalk Server artifacts generally running on premise. There's some good news here. So schemas can be reused pretty much as is. These are upgraded or uploaded to your integration accounts for schemas, and this includes any custom flat file schemas that you may have created. So this is great at continuing to parse that flat file data in your Logic Apps. If you are using standard edition Logic Apps, it's a little bit different. You can upload your schemas directly into your standard edition app service plan, and we'll see that when we dive into that in more detail later. So just understand now, you can get reuse from your schemas as well as from your maps. They also upload to your integration accounts or to your standard edition containers, and it allows you to also even use your external assemblies that you may have called within your transforms. There are a few functoids, like the database functoid and stuff like that, that don't work. And there is a little bit of prep work in general that kind of needs to be done with your maps if you have complex logic in there and want to do logging and stuff like that. There's a great document on this on the Microsoft website. If you just search, BizTalk port into Logic Apps transforms or something like that, you're going to be able to find it. So it's very detailed about what you need to do. But for the later demo, when we do integration accounts, I just export the XSLT, upload it to the portal, and it just transforms just fine, exactly as is. So you can get some reuse, so that could be a huge benefit of looking at moving from BizTalk. You can get some reuse, so that could be a huge benefit of moving from BizTalk to Logic Apps. Orchestrations. So at one point there was a converter tool available. I'm not sure it worked the greatest of taking an orchestration and making it a Logic app, but in general, if you open up your orchestration and you start building a Logic app in the designer, you're going to see that it's going to be pretty straightforward to map those shapes and actions back and forth, just with them kind of open side by side. So let's talk about a little bit of terminology. So triggers, you'll hear about triggers a lot in Logic apps, and this is really how they start. There's two main types of triggers. So there's polling-based triggers and there's push-based triggers. So polling-based does exactly what it sounds like. It's going to be essentially a timed process, going to go look for new messages, like in a queue, for example, every 3 seconds or every 30 seconds or something like that. And then push triggers where things are going to call into that Logic app. So like an HTTP endpoint, you could call into that Logic app to trigger the Logic app to execute. We also have actions. So the actions are what does the work inside of a Logic app. These are what we call shapes in BizTalk. I will interchange the two constantly, and I shouldn't. It's very well defined that the Logic app is an action. So keep that in mind. You might hear me in other videos say it's a shape, but really is an action. Logic apps are actions. It does the work inside there. Then you have connectors, and these inside Logic apps are what talks to something else. You'll hear these called API connections at times. The best way to think of these is kind of like an adapter in BizTalk, except there's a whole lot more of them. In BizTalk, we had a handful, maybe 24 at max, different adapters. Here we have hundreds and hundreds of connectors. There's constantly adding new connectors, and we can even create our own custom connectors very easily if we would like. Anybody that tried to create a custom adapter in BizTalk knows that it was extremely challenging to get it done right. It's very straightforward to create custom API connectors in Logic apps. So that's cool. The connectors in Logic apps do all require configuration. So these are essentially Microsoft, most of them are Microsoft managed, and they require certain inputs. So like API keys or destinations or like SQL connection strings. So all connectors are going to require some sort of configuration. And once you select a connector, then that connector will give you a series of actions and triggers that you can use. So certain, like a SQL connector, will have a trigger like data exists from that query, and it will have an action like delete row or call store procedure or stuff like that. So a given connector will have both triggers and actions. So present day Logic apps. We have a couple different models. We have consumption model, then we have the standard model. I'm going to go into these in much more detail in another video, but just to understand there are two different models of Logic apps. Standard edition does support a stateless workflow, which is nice, so you can turn off the logging and get better performance, and it does support on-prem deployments. This leads us to two different designers. So the consumption model is going to have one designer. Standard edition has a slightly different designer. Look and feel is different between the two, but at the end of the day, they will make the same flows. But the two are not compatible. You can't take a standard edition Logic app and directly use it in consumption, and vice versa. So that's the two different designers do produce different output. There are several different hosting models. I mean, like I said, we're going to dive into this a lot more in another video, but just understand that the hosting models are going to be different between consumption and standard. And Logic apps in general, whether it's consumption or standard, it's really all about understanding the rules. Anything you do in Logic apps, you could build and custom code yourself. But what you get with Logic apps is the platform that runs the Logic apps, does the logging, provides you the designer, provides you that low code experience. And with that, there are some rules. Logic Apps, like I said, is all about the platform that it's going to run on. There's limits and configuration references for Logic Apps all over the place. There's a full list of the Logic App kind of workflow, throughput limits, and stuff like that here. The key thing to take away here is that the limits exist to ensure that you don't overrun the system. So, for example, there'll be API limits, there'll be limits in file size. I think it's 100 meg inside of a Logic app. And the limits do change over time, generally go up over time. One could question why you would need a 100 meg file in a Logic app to begin with, just like people would try to run that through BizTalk. There's generally better ways to do it, but just understand there are some limits and configuration items you need to understand. Most of the limits are absolutely nothing to worry about, like the 100 meg file size, and you'll find that different connectors will have different limits in terms of file size and stuff like that as well. So understand that the limits aren't just at the Logic app level, they are going to be per API connection as well. The API connections, the most common thing you'll run into is rate limiting, and that's a status of 429. And this is when the Microsoft managed API is saying, hey, you've called me so many times, let's slow it down a little bit so that I don't overwhelm the API connector or your backend system. So 429 will be something you will see. And as you look at each connector, the documentation, it will tell you how many API calls are allowed per minute or per time interval for that call. Thing to keep in mind is this is per API connection that you create. So if you have multiple connections to even the same SQL database, those would have different rate limits. It's just when you use the same connection across the board, those are all pooled together for your rate limit. And we get more into API connections in another module as well. But just keep in mind that these throughput limits aren't for the connector as a whole. It's at your individual instance of that connector that you're making that connection with. Okay, with that, let's dive into a first look at Logic Apps. We're going to jump in and I'm going to show you just a little bit of the basics around a consumption-based Logic app. Okay, I'm over on my virtual machine in my Azure portal. I'm just going to go ahead and create a new resource. And we're just going to show you some of the basics of Logic Apps. So to find my Logic Apps, it's right down here. I could click Logic Apps. Over here under my favorites, I have Logic Apps tagged as well. Or you can go up to the top, create resource. There's many different ways to create resources. I'm just going to click on Logic Apps. And here I have the ability to select some information about this Logic app. I can select what subscription I would like. I'm going to leave that there. I can select a resource group. Let's just create a new one. RG Live Demo for YouTube. And I can give the Logic app a name. First look at a Logic app, and I'm going to say it's a workflow. I can select the region that I would like to put this Logic app in. I'm just going to select, leave it the default, East US. And here I have the ability to select the plan, the type of Logic app I want to create. We're going to focus on consumption right now. So this means this is going to be hosted in Azure and Microsoft's cloud. And let's just go to the next tab over here. And this is where I can add custom tags. So a lot of people will add something like a cost code so that you can do billing back to individual departments, or if you want to be able to see different groupings of things here. This is more from generally more from an accounting and billing perspective. You would organize things into resource groups kind of for deployment and purposes like that. But this is going to be from like a billing perspective. And we'll go to review and create. Here it's just going to confirm that everything is correct. And then you have to click create, and it's going to create that Logic app. And it's going to take just a moment to deploy this Logic app that I've created. Some Azure components take longer than others. Here I can go to this resource, or up here on the right, I have the ability, if you saw that notice, to pin it to my dashboard. So if you miss these notifications, it's this little bell up here. You can go click on that and you'll see all the notifications. I can pin it to my dashboard if I wish. I'm just going to go to that resource now. And here I have kind of the skeleton running components of a Logic app. Over here on the left, you have your deployment tools. So we're going to dive into the designer just in a moment. If I did create connections, there would be API connections listed here. We have some settings for the workflow, authorizations, identity. We won't go into all these in detail, just understand that the settings for this logic app is at the logic app level, not any higher than that. So if you did have settings here, they'd be per logic app. Some monitoring metrics down here, automation tasks, and then your standard kind of help down here. At the top, in the main section, you have overview and your access control. Access control is more useful for other Azure components and sharing access to like service bus queues and stuff like that. But that is here as well. If I had run history, they would be down here. Since it's a brand new logic app and nothing exists, there's no run history. I'm going to jump into Logic App Designer. And this will give you an option to listen to this nice YouTube video if you would like. We can also create these, get started from scratch with these pre-built templates. These are some of the common triggers that you can have. There's also more complex templates down here. So if you were going to do like an HTTP request response, you could select these templates and automatically have some of these API connectors added to your designer surface for you. You can also create custom templates and then upload them and share them across your organization. So if you had interactions with a SQL Server or SAP or something like that, you could create custom templates here for individuals to use as they need it. We're just going to click resource to create a recurrence, to create a recurrence trigger for that logic app. So this is how this logic app gets started. Just leave it at 3 minutes, and we're just going to hit save. And this is just to show you that this is now saved, and I have a basic logic app that's going to run every 3 minutes. Now, nothing's going to happen here. You have to add actions under your trigger. I would go new step, and here you have the ability to select different types of actions that you want to add. So you have built-in ones, standard, enterprise, and custom. And a lot of these are going to be Microsoft hosted API connections. So if you go to standard, for example, it takes it just a moment to populate, and you'll see all these types of API connectors that you can select. So I'll just grab SQL Server, for example, and then you can see here you get the option for all these actions that you can use, or you have triggers, which wouldn't make sense now. I'll have a trigger for the logic app, but you have the ability to select those triggers. So I could also come back and have deleted that trigger and started with a SQL trigger, started a blank logic app and went with that. There is all the options for flow control as well, which is control. So that's going to be this built in. So you have conditions, you have for each loop, scope shapes, and stuff like that. This is going to be a key one for doing our flow control inside our logic app. Another important one is data operations. That's another good one that you can use for manipulating data and stuff like that inside your logic app. So this one here, data operations, is good. Let's just click on that. And here you have a bunch of different actions that you can do, a lot of array manipulations and table manipulations. The compose shape I like to use a lot. All this does is simply allow you to compose data that you can use later on in your logic app. Something else to point out is you can use information from past actions. As you saw here when I clicked on that shape over here on the right, there would be dynamic content available if the trigger above or the actions above supported it. There's no real data in a recurrence, so that's why you don't see it here. You have the ability to click on expressions, and you have all these pre-built functions that are here. We'll see this in action in some later demos, but for now, just understand that you have all these pre-built functions you have access to as well. I'm going to leave this as is and hit save. And I want to jump over here and show you versions. Well, before I show you versions, let's switch to code view. So this is just your designer surface. Underneath it, much like you saw with BizTalk orchestrations, if you work with them, there's a JSON file, a representation of what this means, this actions, the triggers that I've dropped on this surface. You can see that under code view. You always want to save before you go to code view. If not, it'll prompt you here that says you're going to lose unchanged saves. You're going to lose items that are not saved. If you don't pay attention to that and hit OK, you could lose a bunch of configuration you've done in your logic app. I was talking earlier about that limits and configuration of your Logic app, and that same link will outline this whole definition of the Logic app. So this is a defined JSON definition of the Logic app. You could come in here and build it directly in here if you wanted to, I guess, and not use the designer. There are going to be times you're going to jump in here and make changes to things, and we'll show you that in some later videos, but don't be afraid to jump over here into code view and make changes as needed. Now, it is possible to brick this, so I'm going to just make a change that's probably not going to like it. And if you, oh, that actually did save. Let's make it invalid JSON then. And if you try to save, it's not going to let you save this. So if you do make a change in here and you end up messing it up, it's not going to let you save it. So you're going to have to fix that change before you go on. The same is actually true in the Logic App Designer. So if you added an action, for example, and didn't add some of the required parameters, you're not going to be able to save that Logic App until you do that. So let's go ahead and just discard those changes. And let's jump over here to versions, because versions are very important. So as I've saved this Logic app, as we went through things today, each version of that Logic app is actually saved here, and I can go back to them at any time. So I can click on this bottom version, and it's going to give me a read-only view into that Logic app. Now, this one didn't really have much on it. Let's look at the next one. This is where I added the recurrence. And let's say I didn't want to add that compose shape after recurrence. I can simply click promote. It's going to move this Logic app up into the front of the line. Simply hit save. And now this is going to be the prominent executable version of that Logic app. So this is pretty cool if you do go into Logic app. Obviously your Logic apps will be much more complex than this. And if you do want to revert back to an older version, that's all saved for you here when using your designer in the portal for your development. Let's go back to our first look Logic app, go back to overview. And you can see here this Logic app has ran several times. We set up the recurrence to run, and you'll see here multiple executions. If I do want to dive into any of these executions of the Logic app, you just click on it. You'll see your trigger at the top, and I can simply click on that, and I'll actually see, if it was more data in here, you would see the actual inputs and outputs of this call. So if there was an HTTP trigger, for example, you would see the request coming into this trigger and then the response coming out of that trigger in terms of reformatting of the data. So you have input and output of each of these triggers and actions as you go through here. So this can be very useful when debugging and troubleshooting components. So this completes our first look at a Logic app. If you want to learn more, you can see a link to all the videos in this series at my website, stephenwthomas.com/learn. And there's also some Pluralsight courses out there available. 2 are the more current ones about enterprise messaging and enterprise Logic apps. And there's a couple that are a little bit older but still very relevant. Logic apps getting started, and then fundamentals. I go through some more in-depth features of the Logic apps, and even though the designer is a little out of date and the courses are a little older, the concepts are still the same. So feel free to check out those videos and reach out if you have any questions.